Welcome back to the channel. A year ago I did a review of this amazing card, the PicoMEM from FreddyV, and today we're going to be doing a update review 1 year on to see what has improved. So welcome back. Hopefully you watched this video about a year ago of my review of this very impressive card, and at that point I was using firmware from the middle of 2024. Since then there have been several firmware updates and a little bit of a hardware update. So we're going to look at what has changed over the last year. I'm just quickly going to talk about the hardware because that has changed very slightly but not very significantly. This is version 1.11 of the board, which was the most common version around about a year ago. The most recent version is version 1.14. I don't think there's a lot of difference. The main difference I can see is that there's some extra pin headers up here, possibly for expansion in the future. This USB power jumper is missing on the new version, and the overall layout's just changed very slightly. Otherwise, the hardware is essentially the same. There is a version 1.2a, which is the same card, but with the audio integrated into the card. So it's not really a separate version, it's kind of just an integration of this optional part. Freddy also makes a low profile version of this now, which is about 2/3 the height. He's made that specifically for his own development machine, which is a Sinclair PC200. Pretty rare machines. They're pretty cool though, but they only take very shallow ISA cards for some reason. I can't imagine that Sinclair were ever going to release their own range of cards. Maybe they were, but anyway, he's made a low profile version. So if you've got a low profile machine, maybe some laptops might work with that as well. But that's the other option in terms of the hardware. But nothing else has really changed. It still uses the same Raspberry Pi Pico and the same audio daughter board. Still an 8-bit ISA card. So being a software-defined card, most of the interesting stuff that's going on is not in the hardware, it's actually in the firmware of that you get installed onto the Pico. So the best place to come, and the only place to come really, is FreddyV's GitHub page, and that's what you're seeing at the moment. And the most important thing is the firmware folder. So in there currently is the most recent firmware, and there has been a change, it explains it down here, but it's been a change in the naming format of firmware to now include the year, which didn't have included before. So that makes it a little bit more clear as to which firmware exactly you're looking at. All the ones in the root directory here in the firmware are all from 2025. Slightly different versions, and we'll talk about those in a minute. Old versions are in here, so the 2024 versions, for example, are here. The one we're using on the card as it stands originally from my very first review is the July 16th from 2024. As of September 2025, the most up-to-date version is the one from May of 2025, May of this year. There is a more recent one from August in the beta folder. I'm not going to install a beta firmware for this video. If you want to try that yourself, feel free to go ahead. I'm sure it's pretty safe. But in terms of functionality, I want to show you what actually works. So we're going to use the full releases. So May 27th release is the most up-to-date one. The main difference here between them is, there's some older ones there as well from March, but the two from May have slightly different names. This one ends in MD, and that's because it's designed for working better with monochrome displays. If you saw the IBM System 3286 video, that had a monochrome monitor, and when you look at the BIOS on the monochrome monitor, it doesn't look very easy to read. And so Freddy has actually provided a firmware that works better on monochrome displays. What we're going to be using though today is the standard color version. So this is the one we want. So PicoMEM from 27th of May 2025. So we'll go ahead and download that. So what does the new firmware include? So there are some instructions here about how to update the firmware, and we're going to run through that in just a second. And there's also a firmware revision history. Let me just kind of briefly summarize though what's been going on. Very briefly, there are some firmware releases that end in FR, and that uses a special fast RAM mode, but I think that's now incorporated into the main BIOS, so I don't think there are any BIOSes going forward with an FR at the end of them. In terms of functionality, what's different? Well, we've got some option to access to some kind of new sort of features. The first one that was added was the CMS and Townley sound card support. So CMS is the Creative Music System that uses the Philips SAA 1099 sound chips, and you can now get emulation for the CMS and the Tandy, which uses a Texas Instruments sound processor. Both of those are now available for games that support them through the PicoMEM. That's really good. So that's a slight step up from the AdLib. One thing that happened is that one of the underlying libraries that he's used does no longer support standard density SD cards, so you have to have an SDHC card for this to now work. That shouldn't be a problem because most of the cards that are available, certainly recently, are that capacity and are certainly compliant with that standard. You'd have to have a very small old card for it to not be, so you don't have to worry about that so much. There's been an increase in the PS RAM speed, apparently. That was introduced in January of this year, and the speed increase is about 30%, which is decent. The disk info menu that pops up on the screen now includes information on the SIL heads and sectors information of the drive that you're emulating. That also came out in the January 2025 BIOS release. And it also removed any kind of unused menu options from the BIOS, just to make it a little bit clearer. The next release was in March 2025. This was a biggie because you now have access to USB and SD card flash storage from within DOS. So not only those emulated drives that you set up in the BIOS, but you can actually access a FAT32 file system on the SD card itself. So that gives much more flexibility in terms of moving things around, putting things in and out of disk images, etc, etc. So that hopefully is going to be a really, really useful function. We'll explore that later in the video. One of the things that is really, really useful, one thing that I picked up on the original video, is that the PMNet floppy disk chooser, image chooser, is now able to access 128 images, not the original 32 that were limited. You were limited to 2 pages of disks, images basically, and for some multi-disk installs, if you were starting from scratch, that actually wasn't enough. Once you'd installed DOS and a couple of games or a couple of utilities, then 32 actually wasn't enough, but you now can have access to 128 apparently, so that's really good. There's also been a utilities menu added to the BIOS. Now, I'm not very clear from reading the release notes, I'm not very clear exactly what's on there or what that does, so that'll be interesting to investigate. The final set of releases is from May 2025, and another sound card was added. It was the Mindscape music board. I'm not familiar with that board myself, that card, so I don't know anything about it, but always good to have more sound options, particularly for those early DOS games where they sometimes can be a bit picky about what cards they supported. This is before Creative took over and basically dominated the market. You can now also use the PicoMEM to provide a real-time clock functionality to the computer. The caveat with that is that the PicoMEM has to be powered via the USB socket to be able to retain power and therefore retain the real-time clock functionality. So most people aren't going to be powering their PicoMEMs via that tiny USB connector. They're mostly going to just be using them from the ISA bus. So every time you turn the machine off, it's going to lose the date and time. But you can add real-time functionality if you want to power the PicoMEM dedicatedly through the USB socket. So there is this August 2025 firmware that's available in beta, and that includes Covox sound support, which should be interesting. That was a device that went on the parallel port, another sound card, another way of integrating sound into the computer. That's in the beta though, and also some faster disk access is coming, so that will be welcome. We'll do some benchmarking on whether there's been an improvement with the firmware updates already anyway, but it'll be interesting if we can, in the future, get even faster access to the disk images. So yeah, so that's the theory, that's the technicality about what's updated. Let's see if the functionality from our point of view has actually made any difference to this product. This product was already brilliant. Sounds like it's going to be even better. Okay, so how do we update the firmware on a PicoMEM? Well, because it's based on the Pico microcontroller, we actually use that to update the whole card. There's a little button here that says boot cell, and what you do is you plug this card via the micro USB into your computer that you've downloaded the firmware onto. You press this button. This card then appears as a USB drive on your computer. You copy the firmware over to it. Once the file's copied, it should be an automatic process after that. So let's just give it a go. Okay, so you need a micro USB cable, if you can find one of those in 2025. So the timing of this is important. You can't just plug the cable in. well, you can, and it does power up the board, but you won't get the USB storage appearing on your PC. What you need to do is hold this button down as you power it up, and then you get that second window so you can copy across your file. So what we're going to do is exactly that. We're going to take the most up-to-date firmware, copy it across to the Pi, and now that window automatically disappears, and that is because the firmware is updating in the actual Pico. Okay, that's done in theory, so we can now unplug the board and install this in our XT. Okay, you've seen this before, so I'm not going to talk about it in detail, but it's very, very quick on these machines. If you know of anybody who's 3D printing brackets for these or manufacturing brackets for these, please let me know. I would be interested in getting a bracket, make it a little bit firmer. Okay, the PicoMEM's installed. Let's turn it on. See what we get. Don't forget these systems are completely silent. There's no fan in them. So press S for setup as before. So the BIOS build is now different. It's changed to 24th of July 2025 as expected. Let me zoom in so you can see the screen better. So the updated BIOS is showing here. This has changed from version 0.8, which is what the new version is displaying. The previous version was version 0.4, so that's obviously some kind of internal version numbering that Freddy's using for the software. But in terms of the build dates, this is the important thing here. So it's correctly identified the system, 5 and 12 KB RAM, 2 hard disks, 2 floppy drives, no hard disks, and we've set the RQ as 7 on the card itself. Fastboot is defaulted to off, and that's fine. And this page is basically the same as the previous version, apart from the updated build and this version number up here. So the memory page is essentially the same. There's not much difference, apart from down here before we had settings for 2 ROM BIOSes, 2 ROMs that you could install. That's now missing. That functionality was never enabled, so you just remove that, just so we don't get confused with that, which we did in the first video if you have a look. So the disk page is also pretty much exactly the same. No changes here. We've also got the settings for the previous system I'm using this in, the Dell System 200. Great series of videos if you want to have a look up there, I'll put a link. But we can obviously change these to whatever we want them to be. Still 4 hard disks, 2 floppy disks available, and you can create new images from within the BIOS itself. None of that has changed. So this is where one of the major changes has happened in the audio tab. So we've still got the global audio output on-off toggle, but we now have a choice of 4 different sound cards. Before it was just the ad-lib, but now we've got the got CMS, got Tandy Sound, and we've got this Mindscape entry, which I'm not sure what that is. May conflict with XTID and NE2000, so we'll have to look at what that is exactly, but these 3 things may prove very useful. So yes, that's the Mindscape music board that we were talking about in the BIOS updates, wasn't it? Totally not familiar with that, so not sure we're going to have a chance to play with that because I'm not sure how many bits of software actually support it. So the other menu is pretty much unchanged, apart from, again, the unused options down here have been removed. So we've got the network card settings as before. We've got USB host still, got USB joystick still, and we've now got the real-time clock option. Should we use it? This XT actually has a real-time clock anyway, so we're not going to use that functionality on this particular machine. And as I said, you'd have to have the PicoMEM powered permanently via USB for it to be functional in most XT devices. Next, we've got this mysterious tools menu. Show infos. Okay, so it's just telling us what the PicoMEM is running. So it's got the Raspberry Pi 2040 running at 280 megahertz, so it is definitely overclocked. So it's got 8 megabytes of extra RAM on the board running at 110 megahertz. Okay, so let's see if we still got the original discs on here. Oh, looks like we haven't. Looks like I've used a blank SD card for that install, so let's get the appropriate software for this machine on here. So we do that very easily just by popping the SD card out and copying some files across, or we could do it old school. We could create a hard disk in here and then load up some software via floppy disk. Let's go the easy route for now, just to make the video shorter. The card is installed, new BIOS is in there, and so I thought I'd do some benchmarking. The first one I've done is this disk test, and I've come up with a very weird result actually. So both the write and the read speeds are less than prior to the update. And in the case of the write speed, they're kind of like over an order of magnitude worse. So I'm not sure if I've done something wrong. It's the same SD card, it's the same computer. The only thing that's changed is the BIOS update. So I'm not sure quite what's going on there. Well, I might have to repeat that actually. So yeah, second run, pretty much exactly the same results. So there's obviously been a change in the code for disk access that's slowing things down a little bit. Well, quite a lot actually. So I'll dig into that a little bit deeper in a bit. Let's try another benchmark. So yeah, running Norton System Info, we're getting the same CPU speed, which obviously makes sense. But the hard disk speed is giving a score of 2.0, whereas we got 3.1 with the previous firmware. So there's definitely something up with the reader and possibly, especially the write speeds on the new firmware. Interesting. Okay, so I got back in touch with FreddyV, and he confirmed that those numbers I was getting were way off. And so we tried some beta firmware. I tried deoxiting the SD card socket and the ISA sockets, and I did various other bits of troubleshooting, and it just didn't work. It didn't improve. So I think that SD card just happened to fail at a point where I switched it from one system to another, because I've got another SD card in here, and as you can see, the numbers are much more reasonable. 275 for writes and nearly 400 for reads. So things have come back to normal. It must have been the SD card, unfortunately. Just as at the timing was just a little bit coincidental. So there have been some performance improvements. I can't show those to you now because I'm using a different SD card to the one we used in the original review, so I can't prove that to you, unfortunately. But FreddyV confirms there are so definitely some performance improvements. So what else have we got? Okay, so the next feature we're going to talk about is how to access the SD card file system from within DOS. So I'm not talking about a hard drive image or a floppy disk image that's stored on the SD card. I mean the actual SD card FAT32 partition itself. So basically looking outside the box, as it were. And we do that with the pmdfs command. And there's two different versions, one that's for DOS 3 specifically, and we are running DOS 3, so that's one we're going to use, but for later versions of DOS the other command works. So let's try pmdfs3, and we're going to get a little summary of how it works. So you basically allocate either the SD card or the USB device, if you have one attached, to a drive letter, either D or E, for example. Now, this works by essentially mapping a network file share into the file system. So you've got support for bigger partitions, etc., because it's all handled through the network stack rather than the hard drive stack. So let's give it a try. pmdfs3. I'm not sure if it's case sensitive. So let's go SD card. So let's go SD card as drive E and see what happens. Okay, install drive E as S. So we've got drive C. This is the one we booted from. This is where our operating system is. I also have drive D as a virtual drive because I have some additional utilities and stuff on here. Okay, but both of those are drive images on the SD card. Let's actually have a look, see if we can access the SD card itself. And there we are. So if you've used a PicoMEM before, you'll know the floppy and the HDD folders are where those images are stored. So if we go into HDD, we can see the images. So PC1512D and D33NV8. They're the ones that I have in the BIOS selected as C and D. But now we're actually looking outside of that, from above as it were, at the actual root filing system of the whole SD card. Now that gives us massive functionality. For example, if we look in the floppy folder, okay, I have this selection of floppy disk images. So in terms of emulating floppy drives, I can only get stuff onto this computer by adding floppy disk images into this folder and then selecting them with PicoMEM and then installing the software. But now, because we have access to the whole file system, I've got access to all these other folders. So for example, on here, I've put in some extra software. So for example, As Easy As. So As Easy As was a clone of Lotus 123, and it got released as freeware recently. Well, I say recently, a few years ago. And I used to use As Easy as an alternative to Lotus 123 all the time back in the late 80s. And so it was really nice for me to see that this had been released into essentially the public domain. So is there an install? There is an install. So let's see how this works. Okay, so at this point I haven't got PicoMEM loaded. Okay, I cannot access any floppy disk drive images. If I press Shift Control F2, I don't get the little menu appear with the drives selected. So this is running straight off the root filing system. Absolutely brilliant. And we're going to install it onto the C drive as easy, and then press F10 to install. Okay, source drive directory not ready. Okay, so that hasn't worked, unfortunately, which is interesting. But it kind of doesn't matter. Oh, nice colours now. So because if we go to the D drive, which is one of the hard disk images, and create a temporary directory. Okay, and then go back to the E drive, which isn't an emulated drive. And we can copy all of those onto the actual hard drive. Perfect. Right, if we go back to D drive, can we run the install from there? Yes, we can. Okay, so I wasn't happy that the install source was a network share, but now that we've copied it to an actual drive image, it's happily installing. So we now have complete freedom to access any file on the SD card from within one of the imaged hard drives. Massive flexibility there. We can install programs that we don't have an image of the drive for. We can install stuff that may have drive images that are multi-disk but run through a GUI, so we can't use PicoMEM to install those. We just copy the drive contents directly to the hard drive from the SD card. Game changer. And there we go, done. So we now need to run through the setup. I'm just going to put the shareware number in for now, but I'm just going to install it as shareware for now, but it's finished. The actual serial number is available from the site where you can download the official As Easy As binaries. Brilliant bit of software. I really like this back in the 80s. There we go. So we have that. Is it as easy? So we just load that. So it was about 1/10 the price of Lotus 123, about 90% of the functionality of Lotus 123. The floppy disk didn't have those really weird floppy disks that had to be in the drive for you to actually load the program. So brilliant, brilliant stuff. Look at that. Fully functional. It was really quick as well. I remember this being much quicker than some of the other clones of Lotus 123 when it came out. But we're getting distracted. That was just an example of how we can use the SD card to access files outside of the virtual drive images. All right, so that's one part of it. The other part of it is, in theory, we can load images or files or whatever we want from a USB drive. So I have a USB on-the-go adapter plugged into the micro USB on the PicoMEM. I've got an extension cable here. I'm going to plug this in. Okay, and then we're going to run that command again and see if we can access this. PicoMEM DFS 3, and then we want USB equal to drive F. Let's see if that works. Okay, so you can't load it twice, so we need to unload it first. I think that was with a U, wasn't it? Yes. So although you can't load it twice, you can add both the SD card and the USB at the same time in the same command line. You just can't do them afterwards, it looks like. So we want this to be drive E in this case. So now we're accessing, in theory, the USB drive. Installed USB on drive E. So let's have a look at drive E. And on here I have just loads and loads of floppy disk images. So I would normally have to access those by copying them to the floppy disk folder. And I have 138. And if I did that, that would be way too many for PMInit to show, although it has got this upgraded 128 images limit. So we can now access those from USB drives. So we can actually add stuff onto the PicoMEM without having to disassemble the computer. That is another great bonus. Very, very impressive. So interestingly, the information function of PMInit doesn't tell us about any drives that are attached through the new PMDFS command. Don't know whether that's going to get updated in the future. It only tells us the ones that are actually in the virtual hard disks through the BIOS. PMInit itself has some new features. So basically you can now turn on and turn off the individual sound emulations from the command line. So you don't need to go to the BIOS to do that at the moment. So at the moment we've got AdLib turned on from in the BIOS. So what we should do is see if we can get some AdLib emulation going. We know that in the first video I used Prince of Persia to prove that that was working. So we won't do that again. Let's try something different. Okay, music. So after a little bit of help from FreddyV, there are a couple of bugs potentially in various bits of the setup. But basically I've got it working, and let me just show you that. So I've created a directory called music, and in here we've got mod player XT from FreddyV, and the reason I'm using that is because it allows us to test the individual sound systems directly from within one bit of software rather than having to reinstall different games, etc. So if we start, okay, so I've got some sample bits of music here, but we need to configure this. So we're going to go, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to turn on Yamaha OPL, so that's AdLib. So let's put that on, turn everything else off, and we'll go into the AdLib directory and see if we can play some AdLib music. So that's working perfectly. Excellent. So that's working really, really nice. So that's AdLib sound. So if we go to, let's turn that off, and we'll try Tandy. We've got some different ones we can play in here. So obviously you can tell the difference straight away. No FM synthesis there, just good old-fashioned square waves, I think they are. 4 channels as well, a bit more limited. Quite funky though. You get the idea. So finally, let's try the CMS. So we turn off the Tandy, turn on the CMS, and find an appropriate file to play. You'll probably recognize this one. More channels, but again a much more basic sound than the AdLib. So if you know the ad-lib version of this, you'll know that that doesn't sound anywhere near as good. It's not bad, I don't dislike it, but once you've heard the ad-lib version, it's not quite the same. Anyway, so there we have it. We have 3 different sound emulations working with the latest firmware. So that is absolutely brilliant. Whatever game you've got in your DOS era, whether it's PC Speaker, ad-lib, Tandy or Creative Music System, then we can play music from it. Very, very good. So that's basically it. That's my update for the PicoMEM for kind of the late part of the summer of 2025. Some big improvements there, particularly with accessing file systems. I think that it really changes the way that you can use the storage on the PicoMEM now. You're not limited to try and mess around with what's available kind of on a separate machine, a bridge machine if you like. You can now do a lot of those things directly from the SD card, a USB stick plugged in on the USB cable. So really, really useful, super, super flexible. I'm definitely gonna have to get some new versions of this. I keep moving this card from machine to machine. I'm sure I'm gonna break it one day. And this card is so useful in so many machines that I definitely need to get some more. All of this is possible because of 2 things. One is the PicoMEM is a software-defined card, but also FreddyV is working really, really hard for the community to get this working and keep doing updates. I don't know where he gets the time. He's working very hard for us. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the update on the PicoMEM. Go buy one, they're amazing. I'm going to go and buy one right now. So that's the end of the video. Hope to see you in the next one. Hope you're enjoying the channel. Please subscribe and don't forget to like this video if you found it useful.